Have you ever wondered what happens to a man who has looked absolute freezing death directly in the face, survived the most catastrophic and traumatizing winter in recorded history, and then is told by his dispatcher that he has to go right back out into that very same freezing void the very next day? Just imagine the profound psychological terror of surviving the apocalyptic winter of 1936, a season that systematically slaughtered an entire generation of drivers in their wooden, canvas-covered death traps, only to realize that the freight still hasn't stopped moving and the country still needs to be fed. The men who survived that frozen massacre were fundamentally changed. They were haunted by the memories of watching their brothers freeze solid behind the steering wheels of primitive machines. They were plagued by the phantom pain of frostbite in their fingers and toes every time the autumn leaves began to fall. But more importantly, the entire American transportation industry was shocked to its very core. The companies, the manufacturers, and the government finally came to a collective, undeniable realization that human willpower, no matter how unbreakable or legendary it might be, cannot out-tough the violent laws of thermodynamics. They realized that sending a man into a -50-degree blizzard in a wooden box with a canvas roof was no longer a display of rugged American grit. It was a guaranteed death sentence that was destroying the supply chain. This collective trauma became the ultimate catalyst for the greatest mechanical revolution in the history of the highway. The era of pure, unprotected suffering was violently forced to an end, and from the frozen ashes of the 1930s rose a completely new breed of machine. We are talking about the birth of the golden age of trucking, the glorious roaring era of the 1950s and 1960s, and the invention of the very first fully integrated steel-armored sleeper cabs. This was not just an upgrade in comfort, it was the creation of a rolling, mechanized fortress specifically engineered to save the lives of the toughest men on Earth. But ask yourself this and really think about the sheer physics of the problem. How exactly do you take a giant rolling refrigerator made of uninsulated solid steel and magically transform it into a sanctuary capable of repelling 50 below zero winds while barreling down a desolate highway at 60 miles an hour? Because the immediate solution to the wooden death traps was to build cabs out of heavy-duty steel. Steel is incredibly strong, it won't splinter in a crash, and it won't tear in a 70-mile-per-hour windstorm. But there is a massive fatal flaw with steel that every single engineer had to face. Steel is one of the most efficient thermal conductors on the planet. If the air outside the truck is -40 degrees, the bare steel on the inside of the cab will instantly drop to -40 degrees, actively sucking the heat out of the driver's body faster than the old wooden cabs ever did. To make a steel cab survivable, they had to completely rethink how a vehicle generates and retains thermal energy. They could no longer rely on the driver stuffing crumpled newspapers down his trousers or lighting suicidal kerosene bonfires underneath a leaking oil pan. The engineers looked at the massive, roaring diesel engines that were becoming the new standard for heavy haulers, engines like the legendary two-stroke Detroit diesels and the early Cummins block, and they realized they had a massive, untapped volcano of thermal energy sitting right in front of the firewall. These massive diesel engines ran incredibly hot, requiring gallons of heavy coolant to keep from melting themselves down. So, the engineers devised a brilliant, life-saving closed-loop system. They routed thick, heavy-duty rubber hoses directly from the engine's scalding hot water jacket, running that boiling pressurized coolant through the firewall and into a densely finned copper heat exchanger mounted directly inside the cab. Behind this copper core, they installed powerful multi-speed electric blower fans. For the very first time in trucking history, when a driver flipped a heavy metal toggle switch on his dashboard, a literal blast of furnace-level heat would violently rush into the cabin. It wasn't a gentle breeze, it was a roaring mechanical hairdryer that could melt the ice off the inside of the windshield in seconds and actually force a driver to take his thick wool coat off in the middle of a blizzard. This introduction of reliable mechanical heat fundamentally altered the very nature of the job. But it was the space directly behind the driver's seat that truly saved their lives and defined this golden era. Before this period, if a driver managed to survive the drive and needed to sleep, he was still forced to curl up on the freezing floorboards or try to find a filthy, disease-ridden boarding house miles off the route. But in the late 1940s and surging through the 1950s, legendary manufacturers like Peterbilt, Kenworth, and Freightliner began offering something that seemed like sheer science fiction to the veterans of the 1920s, the dedicated sleeper berth. Now, you have to understand, These early sleeper cabs were absolutely nothing like the luxurious, sprawling studio apartments you see on the highways today. They were incredibly tight, claustrophobic compartments bolted directly to the back of the day cab, often measuring no more than 36 or 40 inches wide. Drivers affectionately and sometimes grimly referred to them as coffin sleepers because of their dark, incredibly cramped dimensions. To get into the bed, a driver couldn't stand up and stretch. He had to physically contort his body, crawl through a small square cutout hole in the back wall of the driving cab, and slide headfirst into the dark, heavily padded box. But to a man who had spent the last decade freezing on a wooden bench, that tiny, cramped steel box was the absolute greatest luxury the world had ever seen. The interior of these Golden Age sleepers was aggressively wrapped in thick, heavy-duty quilted vinyl padding, which served a dual purpose. First, it hid the massive layers of fiberglass insulation that were finally being packed between the inner and outer steel walls, effectively breaking the thermal bridge and stopping the cold from penetrating the cabin. Second, the quilted vinyl acted as a crucial acoustic barrier, desperately trying to muffle the deafening, bone-rattling roar of the diesel engine sitting just a few feet away. For the first time ever, a driver was not sleeping on wooden planks. He was laying on an actual coil spring mattress, surrounded by padded walls, breathing in the intoxicating warm scent of hot vinyl, diesel fuel, and engine oil. But wait, right when you think they finally had it all figured out? Let me ask you a question that brings the terror rushing right back. What happens if you're sleeping soundly in your insulated vinyl-padded steel coffin entirely dependent on the hot coolant from the engine to keep you alive, and that massive diesel engine suddenly coughs, sputters, and dies in the middle of a desolate Wyoming night? Because unlike modern trucks that have independent battery-powered auxiliary power units and digital thermostats that can heat a cab with the engine completely shut off, the drivers of the 1950s and 60s had absolutely no backup system. Their entire life support mechanism was directly and inextricably tied to the continuous combustion of that primary engine. If the engine stopped spinning, the water pump stopped circulating the boiling coolant. Within 15 minutes, the copper heater core would go completely cold. Within 30 minutes, the -50-degree wind howling against the thin steel exterior would overpower the fiberglass insulation, and the temperature inside the sleeper would begin a terrifying, rapid plunge toward absolute zero. This lingering, ever-present threat of mechanical failure completely dictated the culture and the driving style of the Golden Age trucker. It birthed the legendary culture of the endless idle. During the brutal winter months, a trucker would literally never shut his engine off. From the moment he left the terminal in Chicago until the moment he arrived in Seattle a week later, that massive diesel engine would run continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When they pulled into a truck stop to eat a chicken-fried steak and drink black coffee, the engine idled in the lot, sending massive plumes of white smoke into the freezing night sky. When they crawled back into their coffin sleepers to get 4 hours of desperately needed rest, the engine idled just inches beneath them, shaking the entire chassis with a violent, rhythmic violence. They did not care about fuel efficiency. They did not care about noise ordinances or emissions. They cared about one thing and one thing only: keeping the mechanical heart of the truck beating so that their own human hearts wouldn't freeze and stop in the dark. Have you ever seriously tried to imagine what it physically feels like to fall asleep with your head resting just 30 inches above a screaming, naturally aspirated, two-stroke Detroit diesel engine that vibrates so violently it can literally rattle your teeth out of your skull? Today, we value complete silence. We want our cars to be soundproof vaults, isolating us from the reality of the road. But the Golden Age sleeper cab was an absolute assault on the human senses. There was no peace, and there was certainly no quiet. When a driver crawled through that small cutout hole and laid down on his mattress, he was essentially strapping himself directly to an industrial power plant. The vibration was so intense that it would cause the driver's vision to physically blur if he rested his head directly against the back wall. The noise was a continuous deafening roar of mechanical explosions, grinding gears, and whining turbochargers that completely drowned out any possibility of normal thought. But here's the most fascinating, unbelievable psychological twist of the Golden Age trucker. They did not hate the noise. In fact, they absolutely loved it, and they depended on it for their very sanity. To the traumatized veterans who remembered the deadly, terrifying silence of a frozen engine in the 1930s, the deafening roar of that idling diesel was the sweetest, most comforting lullaby in the entire world. It was the undeniable sound of life. As long as the floorboards were vibrating, as long as the smell of burning diesel was seeping through the floor, and as long as that massive fan was pushing hot air into the cab, they knew they were perfectly safe. They conditioned their bodies to sleep through the mechanical earthquake. Their brains became hyper-tuned to the specific rhythm of their engine. They could be in a state of deep exhausted slumber. But if that engine so much as missed a single cylinder fire, or if the idle dropped by just 50 revolutions per minute, they would jolt wide awake in a pure panic, instantly knowing that their life support system was failing. The truck was no longer just a machine they operated. It had become a living, breathing extension of their own nervous system, an iron beast that they formed a deep symbiotic relationship with in order to survive the winter. This profound shift in technology completely revolutionized the psychology of the American truck driver, completely altering how they viewed themselves and their place in the world. They transitioned from being desperate, terrified survivors of the elements to becoming the undisputed, swaggering kings of the asphalt. In the 1920s and 30s, driving a truck was seen as a brutal, low-class job for men who had no other options. A job characterized by dirt, suffering, and a high probability of death. But by the time the 1960s rolled around, with the advent of these massive, gleaming, chrome-covered sleeper cabs, the trucker became a romanticized American icon, the modern equivalent of the cowboy riding his steel horse across the untamed frontier. They had conquered the winter. They were no longer at the mercy of the blizzard. They were actively laughing at it from behind a wall of heated, insulated steel. This newfound security birthed an incredible culture of pride and independence. They began to customize their rigs, polishing the massive aluminum fuel tanks, installing towering chrome exhaust stacks, and painting their trucks in bright, aggressive colors. They wore custom-tooled leather boots, pearl-snap shirts, and denim jackets, embracing an outlaw aesthetic that captivated the entire nation. The sleeper cab was not just a place to avoid freezing to death. It was their personal castle, their mobile domain where they had absolute sovereignty over their environment. When a massive winter storm dumped 3 feet of snow across the Great Plains, shutting down airports and bringing passenger cars to a grinding, terrified halt, the Golden Age trucker would simply gear down his massive unsynchronized transmission, blast the heat from his copper core heater, and plow straight through the snowdrifts, a roaring leviathan of steel and fire entirely unfazed by the apocalypse happening outside his windshield. They possessed a level of supreme confidence that bordered on arrogance, but it was an arrogance entirely earned by the blood and suffering of the men who had come before them. But I need you to pause and consider a completely different kind of challenge. Because surviving the cold is one thing, but how do you survive the crushing, overwhelming weight of the psychological isolation? Imagine you're driving a 1955 Peterbilt across the desolate, frozen expanses of Montana at 2 o'clock in the morning. The heater is blasting, the engine is roaring, and you are physically warm, but you are entirely alone. There are no cell phones. There are no satellite radios playing thousands of channels of high-definition music. The AM radio in your dash only picks up a faint, crackling signal of a country music station that fades out every time you drive through a valley. The darkness outside your headlights is absolute, a terrifying, endless void of black and white. In this era, long before the Citizens Band or CB radio became the massive cultural phenomenon it would be in the 1970s, the Golden Age trucker had to navigate a landscape of extreme mental solitude. This profound isolation is what birthed the legendary network of the American truck stop and the Golden Era diner culture. Because they couldn't talk to each other inside the cabs, the moments when they finally pulled over became incredibly vital for their mental health. These independent, lonely road warriors would congregate in brightly lit, grease-stained diners tucked away on the edges of the 2-lane highways, places like the legendary Iowa 80 or tiny mom-and-pop joints that never closed. They would sit at the Formica counters, drinking bottomless cups of scalding black coffee, smoking unfiltered cigarettes, and rapidly exchanging vital, life-saving information. They didn't just talk about the weather, they mapped out the survival routes. They would tell each other exactly which mountain passes were iced over, which way stations had corrupt inspectors, and where the snowplows had completely given up. This was a physical, face-to-face brotherhood, a tight-knit fraternity of men who knew that they were completely on their own out there, and that the only people who truly understood the massive burden they carried were the other exhausted men sitting on the diner stools next to them. When you really break down the mechanics of what these men were doing, it is almost impossible to comprehend the level of physical skill and mechanical sympathy required to operate a Golden Age sleeper truck in sub-zero weather. Today, a driver can push a button and an automated transmission shifts perfectly, Computer sensors monitor traction, and anti-lock brakes prevent sliding on ice. But the trucks of the 50s and 60s were entirely analog, requiring a driver to be half mechanic and half athlete. They drove trucks equipped with twin-stick transmissions, meaning they had to operate two separate gear shift levers simultaneously, reaching their arms through the steering wheel to perfectly match the engine revolutions just to change a gear. If they missed a gear on a steep, icy downgrade in the Rocky Mountains, there was no computer to save them. The massive weight of the trailer would simply push the truck over the cliff. To prevent their air brakes from freezing solid in the -40-degree temperatures, they had to constantly crawl under the trailer in the snow to manually drain the condensation valves. Because if moisture built up in the lines, it would instantly turn to ice and lock the brakes up completely. They had to intuitively know the exact mixture of kerosene to blend into their diesel tanks, to lower the gelling point of the fuel, because if the fuel gelled in the lines while they were driving, the engine would violently stall, instantly cutting off their heat and plunging their steel cab into a deep freeze. They didn't just drive the truck, they managed a highly volatile, completely manual power plant that required constant hyper-vigilant attention. Their physical survival depended entirely on their ability to listen to the mechanical symphony of the truck, identifying a failing bearing or a clogging fuel filter purely by a slight change in the pitch of the engine noise over the roar of the wind. They were masters of an incredibly dangerous craft, executing maneuvers on pure black ice with a level of precision and raw nerve that makes modern driving look like playing a video game. So, how did this era of raw mechanical power and cramped, vibrating sleeper boxes eventually evolve into the rolling palaces we see dominating the interstates today? The truth is, the golden age of the 1950s and 60s laid the absolute, unshakable foundation for every single modern luxury a trucker enjoys right now. The engineers realized that if a driver could survive and actually sleep in a 36-inch coffin box, then expanding that box could completely revolutionize the logistics industry. The concept of the sleeper cab proved that a driver could legally and safely live on the road for weeks or even months at a time, drastically increasing the speed and efficiency of the American supply chain. Slowly, decade by decade, the boxes grew larger. The 36-inch coffin expanded to a 60-inch walk-in sleeper, then to a massive 72-inch studio with high roofs, aerodynamic fairings, and independent climate control. The violent two-stroke engines were eventually replaced by highly efficient, heavily muffled electronic diesel engines that vibrate a fraction of the amount. The brutal, unsynchronized transmissions were swapped out for seamless automatics. But the paradox is that as the machines became infinitely more comfortable, safer, and technologically advanced, some of the legendary grit and the intense, unbreakable brotherhood of the Golden Age slowly began to fade away. When you isolate a driver in a perfectly silent, computer-controlled, climate-perfect box, they lose that vital, terrifying connection to the elements that forced the early pioneers to band together. The Golden Age trucker didn't have luxury. He had a heater, a mattress, and an engine that he prayed would not stall. But what he lacked in comfort, he made up for in an unprecedented level of absolute, rugged independence and a pure, unadulterated swagger that defined a generation and built the modern world. When you look back at the incredible journey from the freezing, deadly wooden boxes of the 1930s to the heated, roaring steel fortresses of the 1960s, it is a testament to the relentless human drive to conquer the impossible. These men took a profession that was practically a death sentence and transformed it into the very backbone of the American economy. They stared into the abyss of a -50-degree winter, and instead of backing down, they wrapped themselves in steel, fired up a massive diesel engine, and drove straight through the heart of the storm. They were the ultimate road warriors, the undeniable legends of the highway whose sacrifices and suffering directly resulted in the creation of the sleeper cab, the single most important safety invention in the history of commercial transportation. The next time you're driving down a dark interstate in the dead of winter, with your heated seats turned on and your favorite podcast playing through perfectly clear speakers, and you see a massive semi-truck blast past you in the left lane, its chrome exhaust stacks cutting through the freezing air, I want you to remember the history pounding beneath its tires. I want you to think about the men who fought for the right to simply sleep in a warm box without the fear of suffocating or freezing to death in their sleep. I want you to respect the incredibly violent, dangerous, and loud history of the Golden Age sleeper cab, because without those primitive, vibrating metal coffins, the modern world, as you know, it simply would not exist. Now, I want to hear directly from you. If you had to make a choice tonight, would you rather be perfectly comfortable in a highly monitored, computer-controlled modern truck where every single move is tracked by a dispatcher, or would you trade all of that luxury to go back in time, crawl into a tiny, vibrating 36-inch coffin sleeper, and experience the absolute, pure, unmonitored freedom of the Golden Age highway? Let me know which era you would choose and why down in the comments below, because I make it an absolute point to read every single one of your opinions. If this deep dive into the fascinating, roaring history of how the steel sleeper cab saved an entire generation of truckers from freezing to death gave you a completely new perspective on the giants that roam our highways, you absolutely need to hit that like button right now. Hitting like is the only way to tell the algorithm to push these forgotten, legendary stories out to a wider audience so that the history of these incredible pioneers is never lost to time. And if you are addicted to hearing the intense, untold stories of human survival, mechanical evolution, and the unstoppable force of sheer willpower against nature, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you never miss another journey into the past. We are just scratching the surface of the incredible history of the highway. Stay relentless, keep pushing your own limits, respect the legends of the road, and I will see you in the next video.